Hi, welcome back, everybody. And our next presenter is going to be León García Garza. He studied anthropology at the Escuela Nacional de Antropología y Historia in his native town of Mexico City. He obtained his bachelor's degree in history and art history at UCLA and his doctoral degree in colonial history of Latin America at the same institution. Dr. García Garagarza's research specialized in the history of Mesoamerican religion and Nahuatl language. He is presently translating the Castilian portion of Sahagun's Florentine Codex at the Getty Research Institute. Please join me in welcoming Dr. García Garza to present Fall of Fragile Empire, Micro-Patriotism, the post-classic article, and disintegration of the Aztec Triple Alliance.
Sorry for writing such long titles. It's a Baroque tradition that we have. Anyway, well, first I want to thank the Getty and all the amazing scholars, teachers, colleagues, students. I'm honored to be sharing the same stage with scholars such as Manuel Aguilar and Kim Richter, Mary Miller, Federico Navarrete, Elisa Sosa. Well, the list is endless. Thank you very much. And this is, of course, in memoriam of Don Miguel León-Portilla, who's the teacher of us all. Let us hear a little bit of the Nahuatl language, which is so sweet. Away inicteca omocacayu in Tenochcatl, notonewak in Iyolo inatl y pantepetlipatlatoca. These words were said in anger and as a chiding, and they were said on the lips of Malintzin, whom we have seen her images and her story, mystical and terrestrial, in this conference. So these words were spoken by Malintzin according to the Annales de Tlatelolco. Of course, you should have been translating some of the admonishments that the victorious and terrifying Cortés was telling Cuauhtémoc in order to justify the legality of his conquest. Something that was certain in a historical sense, that he had used politically the divisions between the constellation of Altepetl city-states in central Mexico, dominated by the Aztecs, in order to destroy the empire with their help. And this is the subject of our paper today. According to the Tlatelolca authors of Book 12 of the Florentine Codex of the Conquest of Mexico, one day, during the last terrible weeks of the siege of Mexico Tlatelolco, the Tenochca Tlatoani Cuauhtémoc received a delegation of leaders from the Chinampaneca region, and that is the region, to the south of Mexico City. This is north, comprising different city-states that we're going to talk about them right now. Comprising the towns of Xochimilco, Mixquic, Coloacan, Cuitláhuac, here at the center, Mexicalcingo and Iztapalapa, here at the very edge. The messengers of these states, some of them were, many of them were lords, came offering help to the desperate defenders of the city, who at that point were besieged. This is around June 1521, in Tlatelolco, having been expelled from Mexico City. The delegates came in the name of the Tlatoca rulers of their cities and pronounced a speech saying that they were ready to pay their debt to the city with a contingent of jaguar and eagle warriors who were arriving on a large flotilla. Let me see if we're here. Who were arriving on a large flotilla of war canoes. They're called acalchimaltica. Acali is a canoe, is a water house. The chimali is the shield, so these are, armored war canoes. and this came from the Chinampaneca region, determined to drive off their common foes, the Spanish Teules, who were at that point about to conquer the island. Cuauhtémoc eagerly welcomed their offer. The fidelity of these subject towns would assure not only a respite from the naval blockade at Cortés's brigantines and the Acalchimaltica of Ixtlilxóchitl of Texcoco had imposed upon the city, but also the continuous supply of food, water, and weapons from this, the most fertile area of the basin of Mexico, that is the Chinampaneca region. The Tenochca exhorted the delegates to take up arms immediately and join the combats that were raging all around the capital. Soon after, however, Cuauhtémoc and his noble companions found out that the Xochimilca warriors, instead of aiding in the defense of the city, were actively attacking the defenders, robbing and slaying women and children, and taking many of them captive on their Acalchimali boats to be sold in the mainland. Aghast, the Mexica Tlatelolcas immediately raised a war cry to attack the traitor Xochimilcas, intercepting them at Nonoalco, where they killed many of them and freed the captives. They then brought back to Cuauhtémoc's headquarters at Yacacolco some captured Chinampanecas. And let me see if I can find the, here we go. We are in this part of the city. It's right between the frontier between Tenochtitlan and Tlatelolco. They brought back to Cuauhtémoc's headquarters at Yacacolco some captured Chinampanecas who revealed that they had conspired with the Spaniards to attack by stealth the island of Mexico. At Cuauhtémoc's side was none other than Mayehuatzin, the Tlatoani of Cuitláhuac, one of these Chinampaneca cities, who angrily admonished his compatriots for their odious betrayal. He then personally sacrificed 4 of them and offered 4 more compatriots to the sacrificial knife of Cuauhtémoc himself. The rest of the prisoners were then duly sacrificed. As word went around town about the Chinampaneca betrayal, the people of Mexico and of Tlatelolco retaliated against all the Xochimilca residents still left in their city, including women, children, and old people. Like the text says, none was spared. So I've been showing you also the place where it's taking place. And it's one of the most vital places in Mexico City today. It's in the very traditional barrio of Peralvillo. It's true. Where there's a beautiful church that actually this Santana parish was erected in the 16th century. Then it was destroyed, and this is a 18th century new parish. So all these historical events happened right there. This episode marked the culmination of an astonishing political turn that steadily set the cities once dominated by the Culua Triple Alliance, and nobody called it the Aztec Triple Alliance, the Xcantla, Tocayotl. Many times all the indigenous informers to Cortés would say, this is the Culua people, the Culua Tlatoani. That's how they knew the so-called Aztecs. So the cities once dominated by the Triple Alliance, the Xcantla Tocayotl, against their indigenous masters. Recent trends in the historiography of the conquest emphasize the crucial role of the indigenous polities in the fall of the Triple Alliance. Against the romantic historiography issued from the work of Prescott, who exalted the heroic feats of a handful of Spanish conquistadors against a mighty empire, the new indigenous trend, in fact, is discovering nothing really new. All the colonial sources about the epic, including those written by Cortés and other Spanish conquistadors, are abundantly clear about the crucial role that the indigenous allies played in the conquest of Mexico. The bulk of the troops was largely made up of warriors native to the cities that consecutively sided with Cortés as he advanced with his campaign of terror to the Culua capital, to Mexico Tenochtitlan. The sources also make clear that the logistical apparatus that sustained Cortés throughout his long journey to victory was sustained by native indigenous states. The political import of this native turnaround, however, is still a matter of discussion among both historians and lay people. Can we speak of an indigenous betrayal of Mexico Tenochtitlan? The answer, as we shall see, must take into account important nuances involving the political economy and international relations between the city-states of the region and Mexico Tenochtitlan. How were political alliances defined? What were the tributary modes of domination and the appropriation of lands and resources for the Culua hegemon? What were the internecine tensions and conflicts inside each altepetl that often resulted in shifting alliances and even rebellions against the mighty Mexica hegemon? The truth is that the area of central Mexico was a veritable mosaic of city-states and confederacies of distinct ethnic compositions. Some of them had been incorporated into the structure of the empire in a more intimate manner than the others. For example, through dynastic alliances that directly linked one faction of a given altepetl to the ruling House of Mexico, while others remained as distant, resentful tributaries, harshly controlled by Mexica military supervisors, the Calpixque. The latter states were ready to strike back against their Culua oppressors as soon as a stronger power appeared in the horizon. City-states such as this were numerous among the Nahua-speaking peoples living in the central valleys of Mexico, Cholula, and Cuernavaca, Cuauhnáhuac, where Mexica domination was generally exerted through a combination of official Mexica Calpixque and the imposition of local noble factions amenable to Mexica domination. Among the majority of Nahua polities, a common Tolteca Chichimeca lineage was universally recognized, even among states that successfully resisted the Mexicas, such as the Tlaxcalan Confederacy or Huejotzinco. Otherwise, the allegiance of non-Nahua groups to the empire was clearly much more tenuous, having no ethnic links to Mexico, and a culture distinct from the Tolteca Chichimeca of central Mexico, the Totonacs of Sempohualan, for instance, they were prompt to rebel against Mexico as soon as they perceived in the outlandish Spanish forces the possibility of freeing themselves from their onerous yoke. Clearly, we cannot speak of a Totonac betrayal of Mexico any more so that we can speak of a Tlaxcalan betrayal. Furthermore, the turnaround in favor of Cortés of those altepetl that had formed the Tlatocayot, that had formed part of the Triple Alliance, or that had been tightly submitted to it as neighboring Nahua-speaking tributaries, cannot qualify as betrayals, but rather as the expedient shift to a new military alliance against former masters. The structure of the Xcantla-Tocayotl, the Triple Alliance, was inherently fragmentary, and its fragile unity hinged on both direct and indirect mechanisms of control. We can state, however, that all of these mechanisms were sustained by the effective threat of military force, and that the empire had little effective political and territorial integrity. Mexico was able to expand its dominion over a large area as long as its military might remained overwhelming. But once a new army promised redemption from Mexica domination, the subaltern altepetl states of the empire fell one after the next, like the proverbial dominoes. It was the Machiavellian merit of Cortés to recognize the fragility of the Culua Empire and to exploit its divisions to become the terrifying, cruel master of the land. So these are some of the subjects that I was talking about, different things that we have to consider in order to see what the relations were between the constellation of thousands of city-states in the region and the relation to Mexico-Tenochtitlan. So it's methodologically, I think, to think about. A thorough analysis of the political economy of the central Mexican altepetl is therefore necessary to understand the reasons behind the increasing support that the members of each one of these gave to Cortés as he advanced to Mexico, particularly in the last phase of the war, once the Spaniards had recovered from the disastrous defeat of the Noche Triste. Fortunately for us, numerous sources from several indigenous polities provide abundant data to conduct this analysis. We've seen all those works, right? The works of Iztlizochitl, Chimalpajin, Tezosomoc, and Tlatelolco, and then the Spanish sources. So I'm not going to linger too much about this. We just had a wonderful talk about these sources. A critical study of these sources, however, will help us evaluate the internecine conflicts that led to the fall of Mexico, providing inside details that are otherwise absent in the Spanish accounts of the conquest, who knew nothing about the real internal politics of each altepetl. The collapse of the Aztec Triple Alliance happened in distinct stages, as one subaltern altepetl after another not only abandoned their tributary obligations to the metropoli, but moreover provided active military and logistical aid to the Spaniards, while unwittingly pledging allegiance to the Spanish king, who at that point was a ghostly, rather mythical figure for them. This process often involved internal conflicts among the members of the nobility of each altepetl, some of whose members chose to find refuge in the besieged Mexico as the invaders tightened the noose around it. Cortés, meanwhile, found that there was no want of opportunistic candidates to occupy the abandoned throne, the petlatl, of each occupied altepetl, ready to pledge their allegiance to him. These were often the siblings of those tlatoque, or rulers, who had fled to Mexico. But other times, they happened to be distant claimants to an abandoned throne, members of the local Pili noble class who had no legal dynastic rights and who were then installed as puppet Cuauhtlatoque. In the brief space of this conference paper, I will only sketch what I consider to be the most important stages of the increasing indigenous support to Cortés against the Mexicas. A more detailed analysis of this fascinating process deserves, of course, a longer treatment than the one that we can provide here. This process can be divided in three main stages, the first two of which I won't elaborate here. This is the first, the initial Totonaca alliance with Cortés in the Altepetl of Zempoala. This alliance fits into a distinct category, that of non-Nahua polities that sided with Cortés. The Totonaca, who did not belong to the common Tolteca Chichimeca tradition of central Mexico, were in that sense ethnically distinct from the Culua Mexica and their neighbors. As non-Nahuas, their military support to the Spaniards was rather weak, but the Zempoaltecas provided the Spaniards crucial intelligence as well as invaluable logistical support. Their Altepetl became the indigenous base of Spanish operations in the Gulf Coast. The Tlaxcalan Alliance. This is the most remarkable alliance and the most famous, or notorious, if you want to say it like that, both in military and political terms, that Cortés ever achieved in central Mexico. The role of the Tlaxcalan Confederacy was pivotal in all aspects. The Tlaxcalans provided the most accurate intelligence and the greater number of troops for the assault against Mexico. It was in Tlaxcala where Cortés found refuge after the disaster of the Noche Triste, so without this unwavering support, he would certainly have been defeated. Rightly after this talk, our dear colleague, our great colleague, Federico Navarrete, will deal at length on the significance that Tlaxcala, with its own imperial conquest program of conquest and domination, had in the fall of Mexico, its role. 3, the successive support of practically all the Nahuatl Aztepetl states in the eastern and southern portions of the Aztec hegemon. This stage is characterized indeed by a domino effect, as it mainly happened as Cortés recovered from the expulsion of the Noche Triste to launch from Tlaxcala a cruel, scorched earth campaign against the basin of Texcoco and the valleys of Tlaxcala and Cuauhnáhuac, or Cuernavaca, to the east and south of Mexico. This is up to the final siege and assault of Mexico and Tlatelolco. This paper concentrates on this third stage, which can in turn be divided in the following stages. A preliminary stage occurring in 1519 as Cortés occupied Cholula and massacred its inhabitants. The local elite was then forced to pledge allegiance and services to Cortés, who set the terms of the amnesty. The Chololtecas, however, were resentful to the end towards the Spaniards, withdrawing their allegiance to the strangers when Cuitláhuac expelled them from Mexico on July of 1520, right after Moctezuma was killed. Even though Cortés considered the Chololteca as traitors according to Spanish law, he was careful to coax back their support during the siege of Mexico in 1521, and the Chololtecas did indeed provide plenty of troops and supplies for the campaign. They did so, however, always half-heartedly. I cannot explain you the details, but it's a fascinating story. B, Cortés' successful occupation of Texcoco. This was perhaps the most important strategic event in Cortés' journey towards Mexico. Texcoco was the second-ranked member of the Triple Alliance and the dominant power in the extensive Acolua province on the eastern margins of the basin. Moreover, several Altepetl states from both the Tepaneca and Chinampa region, the Tepaneca is on the other side, on the western portion of the lake, and the Chinampaneca is at the south. Several Altepetl states from both the Tepaneca and Chinampaneca regions had tributary obligations to Texcoco. The city pledged allegiance to Cortés when he entered the city with the Tlaxcalans on the last day of December 1520. The Extremeño Cortés found the city abandoned by its inhabitants. Its Tlatoani, Cuauhnacochtzin, had fled to Mexico to find refuge there, taking away some noble companions, as well as all the valuables from the city, valuables for Cortés, like gold, etc. A faction of Acolua nobles, however, decided to stay and submit to Cortés. They elected Tecolcotzin, one of the brothers of Cuauhnacotzin, I mean, he had like 100 brothers because they were children of the Zahualpili. One brother of Cuauhnacotzin as their new lord. The Spaniards made Texcoco their operational base from then on. It was there where the brigantines were built and launched. Cortés enjoyed considerable logistical and military support from the Texcocans as well as from the subject states of Acolhuacan, like Coatlichan and Coatepec. Indeed, as members of an important naval city, the Texcocan military contingent led by Ixtlilxochitl, who's for the Spaniards the greatest indigenous hero of the conquest, formed part of Cortés's military camp during the War of Mexico. They kept their loyalty to him even during a short period in June 1521, when the tide apparently turned against the invaders and the greatest part of the allied indigenous troops returned to their respective cities. They all returned en masse to the Spanish side, however, as soon as the Spaniards disabled again the Mexican naval defenses and went to obtain their next victories. The control of Texcoco and Acolhuacan enabled Cortés to then protect his eastern flank, the all-important route to Veracruz. He reinforced this flank by taking the Altepetl of Tepeyacac. This is not the Tepeyac of Mexico City, but it's in Tlaxcala, Pueblo Valley. Tepeyaca, they called it, and he called it Segura de la Frontera, where an important Mexica garrison was harassing his operations. By taking Texcoco, the Spaniards fatally disarticulated the Culua Triple Alliance. It existed no more. Spanish consecutive victories provoked a deluge of new indigenous allies, as Altepetl after Altepetl approached Cortés in subservience, offering him both military and logistical aid, always, of course, under the threat of terror. The most important of these allies was the Confederacy of Chalco and Mecameca. Here we go. Which controlled the access between the valley of Cuernavaca, the Chinampaneca region of the south, the Chinampaneca region on the south of the basin of Texcoco, and the eastern route to Cholula via the passes of the Sierra Nevada. The Confederacy of Chalco and Mecameca comprised a considerable number of Altepetl states whose members were all related by lineage and who had tight political and economic ties. Decades before the conquest, Moctezuma I subjected Chalco only after a hard and protracted war that lasted 12 years. The Chalcas' military prestige remained such that one of their main tributary services to Mexico was as mercenaries. They, however, always resented their submission to the Triple Alliance, which had really onerous terms like bringing women, like virgin women of their lords, to dance in Mexico and to be served sexually, the Tenochca. They, however, always resented their submission to the Triple Alliance. Chalco had competed for over a century with Mexico for hegemonic domination and, of course, over control of the Chinampaneca region, where Chalco itself was located. One historian has rightly observed that in its time, Chalco was something of a superpower. Like other subjected Altepetl, the Chalcas rendered regular tribute to Mexico and had to surrender many of its lands to chosen members of the Tenochca nobility. Cortés's arrival allowed them to rise up against their masters. According to the Chalca chronicler Chimalpajin, the Tlatoque rulers of Tlalmanalco Chalco and the Tlatoani of Tenanco Tepoloya argued before the local Macehualtin commoners that the Spanish Teules should be greeted as allies right after the massacre of Cholula. Chimalpajin quotes their exhortation as they said, "How many times shall the Macehualtin perish? The one who has arrived is a god, and he will be our father and our mother." Reading further also Chimalpajin, we know that there were opposing factions to the Spaniards who prevailed almost until the end of the conquest. The same chronicler states that the Tlatoque rulers of Chalco and of Amecameca both died while Cortés was in Mexico with Moctezuma. Then in 1520, the Cocolistli epidemic decimated the region, killing the Tlatoque of both cities and a great number of Chalca nobles. I'm talking about Chalco and Mecameca. Moctezuma still had time to appoint his favorite candidate, Juanitzin, as Tlatoani of Chalco. When the Spaniards, led by Sandoval, advanced towards Chalco in early 1521, a faction of the nobility that favored Cortés elected Totomihuatzin as their Cuauhtlatoani. He was not from the ruling family, but he was a noble. From that point on, the Spaniards counted with the military and logistical support of the Chalcas, even as the Tlatoani Juanitzin, the legitimate one, and a contingent of Chalca-resistant warriors fought against them at the site of Cuauhtémoc. And this is a feature of all these turnarounds of indigenous people to Mexico. You find indigenous nobles who are able to, under the threat of terror, submit to you and then provide all the richest goods and labor capability and military capability of the city. The organization keeps going on. It was actually the turnaround of Chalco in favor of the Spaniards that precipitated the fall of the rest of the Chinampaneca Altepetl. The martial prestige of the Spaniards was, at that point, as large as the number of indigenous troops that now supported them. Tens of thousands of warriors, porters, builders, personal servants, female cooks in the thousands participated in the campaigns against the heart of the Mexica Empire. The campaign against the Chinampanecas was then launched with heavy military aid and intelligence aid from Chalco, a local power. Xochimilco, the most powerful Chinampaneca altepetl at the time, offered considerable resistance to the invaders before being burned to the ground. The rulers of the rest of the Chinampaneca cities, including dispersed Otomi subjects, then pledged military and logistical allegiance to the invaders. Their aid was invaluable in taking the Tepaneca altepetl of the western side. All this, oops, sorry, they were crucial. I think we can use it actually. Yeah. This is the Tepaneca region, roughly speaking, on the west side. Their aid was invaluable in taking the Tepaneca altepetl of Coyoacan, which became one of the three main Spanish headquarters during the assault of Mexico. Gómara indicates that the three besieging armies of Alvarado, Sandoval, and Cortés distributed their indigenous aid as follows for the campaign that started during the Feast of Pentecostés in early May of 1521. And this is 1 year exactly after the massacre of Tlaxcala, by the way. Number one, the first army, Sandoval, during the campaign against Iztapalapa, and you can see the arrow there, was coming from the Chinampaneca, the south, was aided by 40,000 indigenous troops from Huejotzinco, Chalco, Cholula, and elsewhere, as Gómara precisely says. After taking Iztapalapa, Sandoval eventually positioned his troops in Coyoacan for the final assault against Mexico. 2, Alvarado in Tlacopan. He assaulted Mexico from Tlacopan, the shortest causeway. You can see that, the round thing on the west. He assaulted Mexico from Tlacopan with the aid of 30,000 natives. Gómara does not mention the origin of this, but other Spanish sources say that Alvarado was accompanied by a considerable contingent, mostly from warriors from Tlaxcala. And then number 3, Cristobal de Olid, he took Coloacan. That was the ancient Toltec city from where the Aztecs got their sacred legitimacy. Cristobal de Olid took Coloacan, finding it abandoned from its inhabitants. He established his headquarters there with 30,000 Indians, and here the sources are really imprecise. Once again, Gómara is remiss in naming the ethnic allegiances of these contingents. However, lines before, he stated that Cortés had summoned warriors from Tlaxcala, Huejotzinco, Cholula, Chalco, and other provinces for the final assault against Mexico. And here is just for the expediency of citing a single source with numbers that I'm citing Gómara, but there are parallel accounts of the thousands of indigenous warriors and people who aided the Spaniards at that point. Even after considering Gómara's imprecisions and exaggerations about the number of indigenous allies of Cortés, it is abundantly clear that the bulk of armed power was by far composed of native Nahuatl speakers. It's an indigenous conquest. True, it was the strategic advantage of Spanish cavalry and technology that made effective the onslaught of the native enemies of Mexico against their hated former masters, the Mexicas. But the truth remains that it was this manpower that allowed Cortés to achieve victory in August 1521, and submitting the people to terror, of course, to provide him aid. But we have to always consider that all these Altepetl provided active warriors who were happy in the massacres of the end of the war against Mexico. The episode from the Florentine Codex that we narrated at the beginning of this paper must be understood in the context of the fragile structure of the Triple Alliance hegemon. Cortés and his indigenous allies, in this episode particularly the dominant Altepetl of Texcoco and Chalco, both of which exerted considerable power and influence over several Chinampa cities, they were able to coax noble factions from Iztapalapa, Xochimilco, Cuitláhuac, Mixquic, Coloacan, etc., to instrumentalize their subjects against Mexico and against Tlatelolco to eventually launch a surprise naval attack, mostly with Texcocan forces. But as we saw also at the very end of the terrible siege with Xochimilca forces. While this Chinampa attack against the defenders was unsuccessful, the larger strategic consequences of their betrayal effectively gave the coup de grace to the Culua Empire. The last chance for the defenders to obtain food and fresh water supplies ended when the Xochimilcas decided to side with Cortés, because when the water canal from Chapultepec was broken, most of the fresh water was brought by boats to the city of Mexico. According to the Tlatelolcan accounts, such as the Anales de Tlatelolco and Book 12 of the Florentine Codex, from that moment on, the Mexicas started to kill each other, as one faction favored surrender, while another was determined to fight to the bitter end. And we know which faction won, right? But in the last days of the terrible siege, as the defenders died of thirst and hunger, and thousands of corpses littered the streets and canals around the market of Tlatelolco, even these Mexicas lost heart, said the Tlatelolcas, and they cowardly abandoned the fight to the Tlatelolcas only. In the end, the Tlatelolcas argued that if there had been any betrayal during the fall of Mexico, it was the Mexicas themselves who had cowardly betrayed their common father, Huitzilopochtli. A tragic destiny indeed. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Federico Navarrete Linares. He received his PhD in Mesoamerican Studies and is professor at Instituto de Investigaciones Históricas, Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. He does research on the history of the native peoples of the Americas and their relations with European and Africans, focusing on the way they've adapted to the process of colonialization and state building. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Navarrete Linares to present the Tlaxcalan Conquest.
Hi, good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this wonderful event, and I feel really honored to be with you sharing the results of our current research project on Lienzo de Tlaxcala and the importance of Tlaxcalans in general in the conquest of Mexico. Today I will present the key historical hypothesis behind the Proyecto Lienzo de Tlaxcala that I am currently coordinating at UNAM in collaboration with my fellow scholars, Antonio Jaramillo and Margarita Kosic, as well as a large group of students and artists. The two main aims of our projects are: one, to prepare a digital compilation of all the existent copies and versions of the Lienzo with a visual and historical database that will allow for systematic comparisons of their contents and a reconstruction of the lost 16th century originals. And second, to recreate the lost originals of the Lienzo with a collaboration of contemporary artists, Mariana Castillo de Val and Eduardo Avaroa, who will paint them using original materials and colors. The resulting exhibition will also try to reconstruct the performative and ritual aspects of this visual history, which I shall describe later. The Lienzo de Tlaxcala, a visual history of the conquest produced around 1552 by the members of the Altepeme and city of Tlaxcala, must be recognized as the earliest, most complete, and most detailed account of what we call the conquest of Mexico. This is the earliest general history of the conquest because its three original copies directed to the King of Spain, the Viceroy of New Spain, and the Ciudad, and one that remained in the Ciudad de Tlaxcala, were painted around 1552, well before the publication of the first full Spanish histories of the conquest, and before the elaboration of the Mexica version in the Florentine Codex. It is also the most complete, because it covers not only the conquest of Mexico Tenochtitlan, the 2-year war, which we usually call the conquest of Mexico, but also the ensuing 20 years of military campaigns that led to the conquest and construction of the whole of New Spain, and which I shall call the Mesoamerican Wars, a preliminary title. It is also the most detailed because it depicts over 50 conquests of different individual towns and regions, many more than any other Spanish or indigenous history of the period. To this date, I know of no single history of the 16th century New Spain that mentions so many and so thoroughly. This can be attributed to a simple historical fact. No individual or Spanish captain or soldier, and no single Spanish institution took part in the dozens of different military campaigns of this 20 years war. Here's a list of the places of the conquest mentioned in the Lienzo. The Tlaxcalans were actually the only ones who were present in all of them, and therefore they were the only ones capable of producing such an exhaustive account. Our proposal is that the Lienzo de Tlaxcala could be considered the single most important historical narrative of the conquest due to its chronological proximity to the events, as well as its unparalleled completeness and detail. In this presentation, I shall develop this proposal analyzing the content of the Lienzo and its historical value, the visual narrative organization of the Lienzo, both as a history and as a map, the notion of centrality constructed by the Lienzo, and the materiality of the Lienzo itself and its oral and performative dimensions in order to understand its power to inform, convince, and impress different audiences. If I have time, I would also like to address the relation between the Lienzo and the Tlaxcalan social memory of the conquest. Let's hope time is enough. The first half of the Lienzo de Tlaxcala depicts in a very clear and straightforward manner the main events of what we usually call conquista, the Spanish conquest of Mexico, that is the fall of Mexico Tenochtitlan. It begins with a detailed representation of the establishment of the alliance between the Spanish conquistadors and the Tlaxcalans, and then it represents the war against the Aztecs and the fall of Mexico Tenochtitlan. However, as I have told, the history does not end here. The second half is devoted to the succeeding campaigns and conquests of Pánuco, Michoacán, and northwestern Mesoamerica, including the war against the rebels in the Mixtec region in the 1540s, and it also represents the subjugation of southern Mesoamerica, from the region of Oaxaca all the way to Guatemala and El Salvador. The representations of these events is straightforward and is corroborated by many other historical sources. However, as any other historical discourse, the Lienzo constructs a narrative that gives meaning to these events. The organization of this visual history combines Mesoamerican visual conventions and narrative genres with Western ones. First of all, we have discovered that the Lienzo is a map as well as a history. The so-called allegory at the top depicts the colonial city of Tlaxcala, its 4 constituent Altepetl, and is perfectly oriented, so that Spain to the east is placed on top, as is customary in Mesoamerican maps. The instance here is the comparison I have here is from Codex Fejerbari-Mayer, where the east is also on top of the cosmic schema. As we have seen, the final part of the Lienzo, the historical section, referring to the conquests between 1521 and 1541, is also organized as a map, at least partially, because it places the conquests in their geographical orientations vis-a-vis Tlaxcala, so that the south is the conquest of Central America is at the bottom, and the northern coasts are on top of it. This combination of chronological lineal accounts with geographical representation is typical of colonial Mesoamerican lienzos and maps. The first narrative section of the Lienzo, dealing with the conquest of Mexico Tenochtitlan, is divided into 2 distinct conceptual sections which overlap at key moments. There is a set of scenes depicting the alliance between Tlaxcalans and Spaniards, and in them, each side is clearly separated in opposite camps of the image, and the figure of Malinche, the interpreter of the Spaniards, always occupies a central position. Later, the same position is occupied by the Christian cross and an image of the Virgin Mary in the famous baptism image that Mary Miller showed today. After analyzing these images, as well as the allegory the main image, and related plates from the Descripción Geográfica de Tlaxcala by Diego Muñoz Camargo, I have proposed in a publication that the lienzo establishes an association between Marina, the Virgin Mary, the Sacred Mountain, and the polity of Tlaxcala itself. In this way, the Tlaxcalan social memory of the conquest constructed a complex being, that is, a ritual being that conjoined multiple identities, very much according to the Mesoamerican and Amerindian ritual traditions, as interpreted by Carlos Severi and other anthropologists. This complex being is both human, Marina, the interpreter, divine, the Virgin Mary, collective, Tlaxcala, and physical, the mountain and Cerro Malinche, which is to this date, the big mountain near to Tlaxcala, which has the name of Malinche to this date. Ritual performances, as we shall see, actualized and brought together these different elements. The Tlaxcalans defined their historical role as allies of the Spaniards, appropriating the sacred force of the Mother of God, and presented themselves as the female counterpart of the Spaniards. Almost all the rest of the lienzo is taken by scenes of war, which also follow a very strict narrative pattern. The attacking armies, almost always composed of a plurality of Tlaxcalan warriors with the respective local insignia and a single Spanish horseman, face and defeat their indigenous enemies always presented opposite them, with the toponymical glyph of the settlement, region, or people that is being subjected. The figure of this rampaging caballero sometimes represents individual Spanish captains, Hernán Cortés, Pero de Alvarado, Nuño de Guzmán, but many other of these horsemen are not marked, and they become a metonym, a part for the whole, for the collectivity of Spanish conquistadors. This figure is also a representation of the Spanish patron saint of the war against the Muslims and the infidels, Santiago Matamoros, Santiago the Moor Slayer. He uses a lance or sword, often carries a staff, and is always shown trampling over the dismembered bodies of the defeated enemies, as can be seen in this very early image from Compostela, and also in the portrayal of Charles V as Santiago Matamoros, painted in the 16th century, and trampling over the Turkish Sultan. In a Mesoamerican logic, the horse is, of course, always a horse, or a mazatl, a deer, as those huge unknown beings were initially named by the Nahuas. In their tradition, we should never forget, deer were identified with humans as prey, as solar creatures, and as sacrificial victims. So there was this idea that calling them mazatl actually emphasized their closeness to their human owners. In conjunction with the man up top of the animal, this prey turns into a predator and becomes a potent Tetzahuitl, a violent manifestation of the sacred. The wanton deity tramples over the dismembered inhabitants of Cholula in the first massacre in 1519, of Mexico Tenochtitlan in 1521, and of Quetzaltenango in 1524, all historical massacres in which the Tlaxcalans also participated. We still need to distinguish, one of the aims of our project is to distinguish, if possible, between these types of very violent events and conquests and other types of negotiations, since I am convinced that many of the conquests represented in this lienzo were actually symbolic and were more the result of peaceful negotiations mediated by the Tlaxcalans, but were anyway represented as violent conquests. Surely, many an enemy would be dissuaded by the demonstrated threat of destruction embodied by the Tetzahuitl. This complex being represented the destructive powers of Western military technologies. As such, it constituted the male counterpart to the feminine figure of Malinche, one defined by its aggressiveness and lethality, while the other was characterized by its gentleness and communicative capacities. At the same time, the lienzo clearly presents Malinche ordering the massacre at Cholula. Her pointed hand is an unmistakable sign of command in Mesoamerican visual language. And it is significant that in Hernán Cortés' accounts of the conquest, the only moment in which he mentions mis lenguas, my interpreters, is when Malinche gives him the information that unleashes and justifies this brutal act of violence, the massacre at Cholula. The always present Tlaxcalan warriors embody the military virtues and capacity of their army. In most images, they appear above and behind the rampaging Tetzahuitl of the Caballero, keeping clearly to its good sides. These figures were also able to transmit detailed information about the Altepetl, the particular Tlaxcalan Altepetl, and the specific lineages or tecali that took part in each specific campaign. As late as the 18th century, for instance, we have found identification of individual warriors from specific noble houses in the different campaigns and battles. Another key narrative element of the lienzo is what we have defined as centrality. In the allegory at the top, we see the mountain representing Tlaxcala occupying a central position below the coats of arms of Emperor Charles V. For European eyes, the vertical disposition of the image would have been read as an incontrovertible recognition of the sovereignty and superiority of Spanish power. However, for Mesoamerican eyes, the key position would be the central one occupied by Tlaxcala. Remember also, the emblem of the Spanish king is oriented towards the east of his center, of this center, of Tlaxcala, and the cross, which may also represent the new Spanish capital of Ciudad de Mexico, is to the west. The mountain in the center is a transformation of the traditional glyph for Altepetl, but it's also presided by an image of the Virgin Mary, so that it can also be seen as the hill where the new sanctuary of Nuestra Señora de la Asunción was erected. The message seems quite clear. Tlaxcala is presenting itself as the new Christian cosmic center of New Spain, asserting its centrality while recognizing the sovereignty of the Spaniards. The lienzo presents two other instances of centrality already identified by Byron Hammond. One of them concerns the image in the exact center of the narrative section of the lienzo, which depicts the siege of Mexico Tenochtitlan as what I have defined as a negative quincunx, the destruction of the former cosmic and sacred center. It's the image to the left here. Where's the light? This image, and we can see how the besieging army, which Leon so aptly described, is presented on the four corners of the cosmic center of Mexico Tenochtitlan. This destruction enabled the emergence of a new cosmic center, which is Tlaxcala, on the top. Significantly, the initial page of Codex Mendoza, produced in Mexico City a few years back, earlier than the Lienzo de Tlaxcala, shows that city as a cosmic center, but in the past, because this is not a representation of the present, but of the past, so shows the city as a cosmic center over the conquests of the previous capitals of Tenayocan and Azcapotzalco, which appear below. So we have the same conceptual organization of these political quincunxes, which is the way we can define them. A reading of the visual narrative strategies deployed in the lienzo yields important clues to understanding the power of this monumental piece of cloth, which is 5 meters tall and 3 meters wide, and its visual narrative, its capacity to inform, but also to convince and seduce and impress. The Tlaxcalans, who were already conversant with alphabetic script and Western scriptural traditions by the mid-16th century, would have been perfectly capable of writing down and sending to the Spanish authorities an alphabetic account of the conquest, either in Nahuatl or in Spanish. And they did so at least twice by the pen of Diego Muñoz Camargo, and many other times in different letters and sundry messages sent to the king. However, in this instance, they chose to produce an elaborate visual history, a painted cloth of large dimensions, and a highly sophisticated work of art. By representing their power through a spectacular image, they were being loyal to Mesoamerican traditions, which attributed rhetorical and many other kinds of effective power to compelling and spectacular images. Mesoamerican rulers systematically commissioned massive artistic and architectural works, huge monoliths, painted books, and clothes, in which they deployed historical and religious arguments, bolstering their legitimacy and their power. These works of propaganda, as Joyce Marcus famously characterized them, were also frequently anchors for elaborate ritual performances and became the embodiment of complex beings, which allowed the reenactment of the past feats and conquests that they celebrated. Visual narratives were also quite important in New Spain, since they were employed as vehicles of intercultural communication. We can propose that the Tlacuilome of the Lienzo developed and employed a highly simplified visual idiom that combined the economy of native pictographic conventions and the synthetic pictorial language of Western illustrations and engravings. The result is a remarkably successful intercultural visual history that can be read to this date by many different publics, and which can also be modified. Its materiality can also be modified so that it works as a book, it works as a cloth, it can work in many different formats because of the simplicity of its visual language. This should not deceive us into thinking that the Tlacuilome slavishly copied the Western visual conventions or produced a straightforward or elementary narrative. Simplicity was instead a kind of deceit. Mesoamerican artists had traditionally employed the openness of images to different interpretations and their capacity to work as anchors to diverse verbal discourses and ritual performances, what Wolfgang Iser and the modern theory of reception would call their indeterminacy. Indeterminacy was key in the depiction of complex beings. For instance, in the Piedra de Tizoc, we see above, as in the Lienzo de Tlaxcala, it is quite difficult to decide whether a figure represents a human individual, the king, in the case of Tizoc, a collective, the Mexica, a god, Huitzilopochtli or Tezcatlipoca, or even an animal sometimes. It could be all of these things at the same time, or only one in a particular context. It depends on the context of enunciation and the ritual performances that were carried out around the image. In the colonial period, this indeterminacy also allowed for constructing visual discourses that could be read differently by different audiences, according to their own traditions and their own visual competences. We have already discussed the double reading of the allegory at the top of the lienzo. This plurality of meanings was a key feature of the functioning of the whole history and could not be easily replicated in a written discourse. In this sense, images were strategically much more useful than writing itself. Another dimension of the power of the lienzo is suggested by a piece of information already discussed by Byron Hammond. The records of the Cabildo de Tlaxcala, the local government, tell us that this visual history was finished around 1552, but was not sent to Spain until a decade later. The reason for this inconvenient postponement was the difficulty in manufacturing the feather capes and costumes for the ambassadors that would accompany the lienzo. Why are the feathers so important? For me, the most logical explanation was that the elaborate costumes of the ambassadors were indispensable for the performative presentation of the lienzo and the success of its discourse and its arguments. The feather costumes would most likely be accompanied by music, chants, and dancing, as in most ritual performances in the Mesoamerican and early colonial traditions. And we see this instance of a representation of feather costumes in the Codex Tlatelolco, which refers to the dances collected in Cantares Mexicanos and famously translated by Don Miguel León-Portilla. If this hypothesis is correct, the Tlaxcalan noblemen accompanying the lienzo would have been charged with carrying out a complex ritual performance according to the conventions of Mesoamerican historical genres. They would have narrated the history using a complex mixture of oral genres, such as storytelling, formal discourse, and ritual poetry. They would also have walked over and around the map, reconstructing the complex routes followed by the Tlaxcalan and conquistadors all over New Spain. In this way, the presentation of the lienzo would become a ritual reenactment of the events, a new conquest of New Spain, and a reconstitution of its territory performed once more for the benefit of regal eyes, as well as a ritual assertion of the centrality of Tlaxcala carried out inside the Spanish court. This ritual performance would also have allowed for the manifestation of the complex beings described in the narrative. We can propose then that the Lienzo de Tlaxcala, presented in this manner, would have been much more compelling than a simple written narrative. To use Alfred Yell's concept, it would have a power of captivation that would seduce and impress its audiences by its extraordinary material dimensions, its spectacular beauty, and the sumptuosity of the feather costumes and the ritual performance of the ambassadors. The lienzo was thus a display of power, a bold demonstration of the position of Tlaxcala as the cosmic center of New Spain. Unfortunately, we have not found any account of the presentation of the lienzo in front of Spanish authorities. What we do know is that the embassy that displayed it in the court of the King of Spain accomplished all of its objectives. Tlaxcala's exceptional status and political autonomy were recognized and guaranteed by the crown. Its territory was protected by law, the power of its governments was confirmed and preserved, the nobility of its elites was acknowledged and preserved. We can therefore assume that the lienzo worked, perhaps in all its complicated narrative and ritual dimensions. And this effectiveness is the main demonstration of the historical truth of the lienzo and the leading capacity of the Tlaxcalans as indigenous conquistadors, as true victors of the Mesoamerican works they helped initiate in 1591 and carried out at least until 1541. So, my final argument shall concern the relation of the Lienzo de Tlaxcala to the social memory of the conquest produced by the elites of Tlaxcala at that time. To understand this relation, we must begin by briefly inventorying the different visual, ritual, physical, and the different visual, written, physical, and ritual manifestations of this memory, which are closely related to the lienzo. According to contemporary sources, the images contained in the lienzo were copies, or rather variations, of the murals that had been painted in the new building of the Cabildo de Tlaxcala in the 1540s and which have unfortunately been lost. They are also related to other early codices, such as the Texas manuscript, or the Fragmento de Texas, and the illustrations of the history written in Spanish by Diego Muñoz Camargo a few decades later. The Descripción Geográfica, it's not the Historia, sorry, it's the Descripción Geográfica de Tlaxcala. Some of its images were also copied and reproduced partially in many other manuscripts throughout the colonial period. The lienzo itself was copied in its entirety in the 18th century in Tlaxcala by Illanes, a version that preserved and perhaps added a vast amount of onomastic, genealogical, and political information. The narrative component of the lienzo and the oral and written accounts that accompanied it also inspired, I am sure, the written works of Muñoz Camargo himself and Buenaventura Zapata. The mysterious and poorly understood Relación de Querétaro, an otomi document from the late 17th century, appears also to be inspired by this tradition. These visual images were in turn related to large public performances of historical and religious theater carried out in Tlaxcala during the colonial period and described by several Spanish authors, which commemorated and reenacted the conquest and other historical conflicts between Christians and infidels. The complex beings represented and constructed in the lienzo were incorporated and became the key protagonists of the dances of the conquest, which were adopted by most indigenous groups in the colonial period and are performed in many communities to this date. They are also a central component of the tradition of conchero dance that emerged in the late colonial period and is still widely practiced in also in the US. Similarly, the ritual landscape constructed and depicted in the lienzo still exists. The largest mountain in Tlaxcala is called Cerro Malinche, and the present-day government palace of the state of Tlaxcala contains a contemporary recreation of the visual history presented in the lienzo. This complex social memory was constructed very early in the 16th century, even as the events of the conquest were unfolding and as the triumphant elites of Tlaxcala were seeking a way to consolidate their power and to entrench their victories and conquests. Following the definitions of Aleida and Jan Assmann, we can propose that it institutionalized and systematized, as well as manipulated, suppressed, and selectively preserved the diverse and contradictory collective memories of the generations of statesmen, warriors, settlers, and women that took part in the events of these tumultuous decades. This early crystallization remained constant in the succeeding centuries, but the tradition itself was able to change and adapt to historical transformations and continue sustaining different written, visual, and ritual products. As a manifestation of this complex tradition, the lienzo sought a specific way to convey its key elements to a particular audiences, the Spanish powers that be, and it deployed the most effective narrative, visual, and ritual means to do so in that particular context. The Tlaxcalan social memory of the context was highly durable. lasting in some cases over 5 centuries. It was also quite widespread in the whole of New Spain and was adopted by many other indigenous groups. We can even argue that it became the hegemonic social memory among the indigenous population under Spanish domination, and thus was key to the durability and stability of the colonial regime. In this sense, we could say that the Lienzo de Tlaxcala was not only the earliest and most complete history of the Mesoamerican War, but also perhaps the most influential one until the 19th century. In light of its importance, what remains to be explained is the reasons why modern historians, both in Mexico and abroad, have disregarded and even sometimes actively discredited and undermined the truth and authority of the Lienzo, and also of the Tlaxcalan social memory tradition which it manifests. But that, literally, is another history.
Okay, we will take a 15-minute restroom break and then be back here at 3:15.